January 17, 1781 closed with the forces of Banastre Tarleton for the most part either captured or destroyed. With the men who escaped the Americans, Tarleton moved quickly back to the commander Charles Cornwallis. Morgan knew that when the British commander heard of the defeat, Cornwallis would move quickly to rescue the prisoners and seek revenge. So, Morgan paroled some of the British officers and assigned Pickens' militia the duty of tending to the wounded and burying the dead. As soon as the battlefield was cleared, Morgan went on the move with 1,200 men north until he camped on the east side of the Broad River by the evening of the 17th. Meanwhile, Tarleton briefed Cornwallis of the situation. It's said that as the general heard the report, he put the tip of his sword in the ground and began to lean on the handle until the blade broke. As some of the British prisoners began filing into Charleston, their disgust with Tarleton was apparent, as one redcoat exclaimed in town, "That was the consequence of trusting such a command to a boy like Tarleton." Distraught, Cornwallis did as Morgan expected. He went after the Americans. Cornwallis sent Tarleton west of the Broad River to see if Morgan was still in the vicinity of the battlefield. By that time, Morgan had made it to the Catawba River. Cornwallis traveled north just east of the Broad River. To move faster to catch Morgan and Nathaniel Greene, Cornwallis left behind camp followers and a large part of their baggage train. As the Redcoats crossed the boundary into North Carolina, it would be the last time they or their commander would see South Carolina. Hoping to possibly hold them at the Catawba River, Morgan, after getting reinforcements, began to put guards at and fill in the fords of the river to force Cornwallis to meet him at the ford of his choosing. The loss of most of his light infantry at Cowpens made the march to catch Morgan miserable. The red clay landscape made the roads quagmires, and the slow-moving heavy infantry suffered greatly for want of food, made even more difficult when Cornwallis ordered the burning of the baggage train they had brought with them. The only wagons that were spared were enough to keep medical supplies, salt, and ammunition, and 4 empty wagons for the sick and wounded. Cornwallis set the example by burning his personal baggage, and his officers followed suit. Charles O'Hara described the situation to Duke Grafton as follows: "In this situation, without baggage, necessaries, or provisions of any sort for officer or soldier, in the most barren, inhospitable, unhealthy part of North America, opposed to the most savage, inveterate, perfidious, cruel enemy, with zeal and with bayonets only, it was resolved to follow Greene's army to the end of the world." On January 30th, General Nathaniel Greene arrived to take charge of the American forces and augment the army. To make the march more difficult on Cornwallis, by leading the Redcoat away from his base of supply in South Carolina and to be closer to reinforcements himself, Greene and his army made a mad dash for the Dan River, and the British chased after. The Americans arrived and crossed the Dan on February 14th. Unwilling to stray too far from South Carolina, Cornwallis moved south. Greene went on the attack to harass the weakened British army. Greene sought to draw Cornwallis into battle and defeat the British in a similar manner as Morgan did at Cowpens. Greene even adopted a similar strategy by creating 3 battle lines for a defense in depth to wear down the British. The American forces contained around 4,400 troops. He placed North Carolina militia in the first line with Light Horse Harry Lee's legion of cavalry and infantry, with William Campbell's Virginia infantry supporting the left. Some veterans from Delaware under Kirkwood and William Washington's dragoons supported the right. The Virginia militia in the second line, and he reserved the Continental troops for the third line. On the road that divided the first battle line, he placed 2 artillery pieces. Greene also put 2 cannons with the Continental troops. However, there was one big difference in the battle lines of Morgan and Greene. Morgan had his lines within viewing distance of one another. Greene's lines were hundreds of yards away and interrupted by forest. Cornwallis had about 2,000 troops in his army. He placed the Jaegers and the 33rd and 23rd Light Infantry on the left, supported by the Grenadiers and 2nd Battalion of the Guards. On the right, the 71st Highlanders, the ones not sent with Tarleton to Cowpens, and the German regiment took up the first line, supported by the 1st Battalion of Guards. Between the 2 wings were 2 3-pound cannons under Captain Alexander McLeod. Tarleton and his dragoons remained in reserve to await a rout. In that instance, he would use his horses to run down the retreating enemy. Tarleton had engaged with Lee earlier that day on March 15th and been driven back. As the British were forming their battle lines, the American artillery under Captain Singleton opened up on them. Not causing much damage, Cornwallis ordered his army to advance. With the enemy about 150 yards away, the militia unleashed a volley. However, the British were not stopping. They advanced with bayonets fixed. Some of the militia were able to get off a second volley. The aim of the Americans found their mark and exacted a toll on the advancing British lines. When the redcoats reached the militia, the American line broke nearly immediately. Worse yet for the Americans, the first line militia did not stop at the second line, but kept retreating. Thus, the second line's numbers were not boosted. The men from Delaware did stop and join the second line. On the American right, Lee and Campbell stood their ground, and as the Germans and Highlanders passed by them, the Americans opened up an enfilading fire on their flank. This forced the 71st and Germans to attack Lee's legion. The 1st Battalion Guards were sent to their aid, and drove Lee to the east. The 71st Highlanders broke off that engagement and went to rejoin the main British body. The 2nd American line held firm, particularly its left flank, but its right flank began to drift back toward the center. This allowed the 33rd and the Jaegers to move on past the second line and toward the Continentals. A brutal fight and counterattack by the Continentals drove back the redcoats, but Greene did not pursue. The second line broke, and those militia ran for the rear. Kirkwood's men and Washington's dragoons made for the third line. There is some historical debate. Did Kirkwood and Washington take up position on the left or right of the Continentals? For the purposes of this video, I'll place them on the left of the Continental line. The British moved to engage the third line. The Maryland and Virginia regulars put up an intense fight against Cornwallis. Washington and Kirkwood took advantage of a lull and opening that emerged in the British line to attack, and although it was a brave maneuver, it did not force the British back too far. Seeing that his forces could be in trouble, Cornwallis ordered his artillery to fire grape shot into the battle lines, hitting friend and foe. The Continentals were able to hold off the British for Greene's army to organize a retreat. To the south, Lee disengaged from the private battle with the 2nd Battalion and the Germans, leaving Campbell to be attacked and chased off the field by Tarleton. The Americans had suffered 261 killed and wounded from the Continentals, 361 killed and wounded and missing from the Virginia militia, and 562 killed and wounded and missing from the North Carolina militia. Of the militia casualties, 91%, or 846, were missing. Cornwallis had little over 2,000 troops going into battle and had lost around 515, or over a quarter of his regulars. The British were tired, hungry, and in need of supplies. Cornwallis would lead his men to Wilmington and then finally to Yorktown, where he would be besieged and captured by Washington and Rochambeau. Thank you so much for watching Half History Will Travel. Remember to check out the Patreon page, Facebook page, and Twitter page for the channel, and I'll see you next week.